Good afternoon, and welcome to today's monthly JASA Zoom webinar. As Helen has just noted, I'm Amy Poster, a member of JASA's program committee, working with Victoria Melendez and Allison Tolman. For those of you who are new to JASA, the organization is a volunteer and member-led group that promotes the study and appreciation of Japanese art and culture. In addition to having the opportunity to attend in-person events and trips, our members also receive a copy of the JASA publication Impressions, which is published twice per year. On view through June 7th at Vassar College, the Francis Lehman Loeb Art Center's exhibition Bunmei Kaika, Political Landscape in Early Modern and Modern Japan, explores the impact of the political climate during the late Edo and Meiji eras on political thought and dissemination of prints in Japan. It's my pleasure today to introduce Chelsea Foxwell, Professor of Art History in the Department of East Asian Language and Civilizations at the University of Chicago, and a specialist in this era of printmaking, who was co-author and co-curator with Bradley Bailey of JASA's exhibition Meiji Modern 50 Years of New Japan in 2023, and to introduce the exhibition curator Monique D'Almeida, the Deknatel Curatorial Fellow in Japanese Works on Paper at the Loeb Art Center, who will provide an overview of the exhibition, which focuses on Japanese prints in the college's collection, many recently donated, and to examine how the shift in Japan's national identity during the period was reflected and disseminated in prints during this time. Monique has demonstrated her keen interest as a specialist in Japanese prints, and she has also studied Onagata, Osaka prints, and other subjects. Many of you will also recall JASA's first introduction to her work as a curator when she was a curatorial fellow at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where she impressed us with her vantage point, and when she said, "People might look at prints one way, but to her, it's about the story that's being told to me. That is important." In this exhibition, we're introduced to a variety of subjects that tell us these stories of this era. And with that note, I'd like to introduce our speakers tonight. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I would like to thank Amy, Allison, Victoria for this kind opportunity to speak at JASA virtually, and for Helen for her technical expertise. Additionally, my gratitude goes out to my discussant, Chelsea Foxwell, Professor of Art History at the University of Chicago, for speaking at Bunmei Kaika's opening last February and agreeing to carry on the discussion here for this webinar. The current exhibition, entitled Bunmei Kaika, Political Landscape in Early Modern and Modern Japan, will be on view until June 7th. While the show builds on a series of Asian art exhibitions over the last several years, it is the first exhibition to focus on Japanese woodblock prints at the Loeb Center since Chikanobu Modernity and Nostalgia and Japanese Prints visited the museum in 2007. The majority of works in this exhibition are drawn from our permanent collection and supplemented by generous loans from Vassar alumni and their families. Since the founding gift by Matthew Vassar in 1864, the Loeb's collection has rose to over 22,000 works of art. The collection at the Loeb is grounded in gifts and bequests from our alums and their estates. The museum's collection of Japanese prints is anchored by gifts, as you'll see here, from Cecilia Faulkner Clevinger, class of 1958, Justine Lewis Keitel, class of 1937, and Frances Beatty Adler, class of 1970, along with her husband, Alan Adler. The museum currently boasts a collection of more than 400 Japanese woodblock prints.
Am I supposed to jump in? I don't
Oh, was
remember.
there the first question? Sorry.
Shall I
Uh,
go ahead and ask you a question, or you wanna
yes,
yeah.
you can. Sorry about that.
No problem. Sorry. So, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And um, we've heard a little bit about the Lopes collection, and I thought that I would start off. I've known Monique for a number of years, and it's a long-standing regret of mine that I missed your exhibition at the Philadelphia Museum of Art because I'm a huge fan of, Saigo Takamori prints and so forth, and the Satsuma Rebellion and Yoshitoshi. So, I was so happy to be able to see your exhibition. And so both for people who were able to see it and want to hear more about it, as well as for people who can't make it before the June 7 close, I thought I would ask you some questions today. So the first question I'd like to ask you is if you could just tell us a little bit about Bunmei Kaika as an exhibition. How did it come into being? What was the kind of the impetus behind it?
Yeah, I certainly can. And I believe that's upcoming question. I'll just kind of skip ahead right here. And I'll start right here and I'll say some of the impetus for this was really looking at the collection and thinking about how I can fill in gaps or make certain assessments. A part of my position at the Loeb, I endeavor to make strategic acquisitions to tell more comprehensive story of Japanese woodblock printmaking at the museum. In the case for Bunmei Kaika, for example, I sought to counter the Tokugawa shogunate's facade of a strong nation and underscore for visitors and future audiences the hectic qualities of the Bakumatsu period that went from 1853 to 68, which was a time of great transition. So when I was looking at these works, for example, you'll see on the left Tokaido Fujieda from the scenes of famous places along the Tokaido, also known as processional Tokaido. You'll see the Tokugawa shogunate's procession from Edo to Kyoto in this route of negotiations. However, I during my research, I was really considering including a print that would show this counterbalance, and that fell into Tsukio Yoshitoshi's print, Picture of Landscape at the Oi River on the Tokaido. So it really just published 5 years apart. It captures the difference. And so this procession in Tsukioku Yoshitoshi's print is headed from Kyoto to Edo. And we can tell by the flags with the white chrysanthemum emblazoned upon them that this is imperial possession heading towards. And there's also Mount Fuji, which is this kind of symbolism of longevity that's located right there. Another aspect really is for Asian art in the Loeb's collection was me considering places. And that was in an unfamiliar place, modern landscape in East Asian, Asian American works on paper that I co-created with my colleague Jess D. Breyer, the creator of photography. So in this show, it was really looking at works within the Asian gallery and getting them to go beyond that space into our photography gallery. And it was, in this sense, thinking about the concept of place and place making through how artists use tools and techniques of photography and printmaking to abstract or defamiliarize their landscape. Simultaneously, over the past year, I also had the privilege to work with my colleague, Pier Carlo Tomasi, and you'll see these prints later on in the slide in the image to the right for the archive project, where it really seeks for an opportunity for students to translate the colophon and provide labels and scholarly research for these prints. And the series is the Illustrated History of Great Japan by Adachi Genko that was published in 1885. We have about 40 something prints in the collection.
Amazing. And your position was a 3-year position, right?
Yeah, so my position was 2 years with the possibility to extend into a third year. And my first year, I was fortunate enough to be requested to stay for a third year, and I agreed.
That's amazing. And so were the prints kind of like partially cataloged, or was there basic cataloging done and you got to do the more in-depth research, or what kind of condition was the collection in?
Great question. So the condition of the collection, it was partially cataloged. Of course, we have our object files that have information, and we also had a visit, I believe, in 2022, which really jump-started my position starting. And that was Andy Watsky, Professor Emeritus of Princeton University, as well as Sebastian Isser from Asian Art LLC, coming to do an assessment of the collection. And that really pointed out to my colleagues that there were areas for us to develop and gaps for us to fulfill other cataloging needs that were done. And there were some prints that were misidentified or had general titles, based off of what was happening in the image. And I've been able to go through at least 200 or so, or more, a little bit more of those prints during my time here.
That's so great. Um, do you have a study room where people can view prints? Like if members are interested, can they contact the museum or
Yes,
um
we do have a study room if people are interested to visit our print collection. It is located in the museum, so it's open to the public for a request.
That's amazing. So people can maybe contact the museum in advance and inquire. That's so exciting. Well, what a service you've done to us all by, researching further into these prints. And I know that it wasn't just, holistically cataloging, but it seems that in the process of cataloging, you came up with the idea for this exhibition, Bunmei Kaika. So I'd like to ask you next if you could just give us the concept behind the exhibition and an overview of it, kind of what's its focus.
Yes, exactly. Of course. So I would say the concept and something that always interests me is really people and how they function in a space, and as well as how they are navigating and negotiating power, politics, and any kind of push and pull that they might feel impacts them. And so that's really kind of been the connection throughout the body of my work. The Loeb itself, the collection, is based largely on landscape prints, and that hails to its history of having this wonderful Hudson River School painting collection that started from our charter in the 1860s.
Wow.
They were contributed by our founder. So that is really kind of what I was thinking about. How can I merge landscape and, land is politics. You'll see the title political landscape. It's a double pronged. When we think about what's the political climate, what's the political landscape physically, literally, and figuratively? That's kind of what I was going for this. So the exhibition itself is situated during the long 19th century. So that's going from the 1800s, through I would say really about 1905. And it's when Japan witnessed tremendous change as it transitioned from the military rule of the Tokugawa shogunate in the early modern Edo period, that was from 1603 to 1868. And the phrase itself, Bunmei Kaika, as well, that meant civilization enlightenment. I also would want to say that this went through that Meiji period as well. Um, so for Bunmei Kaika, what is that? It translates to civilization enlightenment, as I mentioned, and it was popularized during the Meiji period. However, the phrase predates Meiji, which is really what prick, prickled my ears into thinking about how this term can be used and turning it on its head. So the term itself, Bume, connoted, ideal Chinese government under Emperor Yao. That's, early dynasties. as well as Kaika, which was grounded in Japanese Buddhism, and that meant to instruct people in the truth and lead them to goodness, and to dispel delusions with teaching and guidance. And so when we think about it from that perspective, and we look at prints during the Edo period, and subsequently the Meiji period, we're able to see how civilization is being structured with a sense of kind of guiding people and how art becomes a tool for that. You also see in the image here that's Fukuzawa Yukichi, who really spearheaded and promoted this term. It became popularized under him. Okay, so I'll go into the next, just a quick summary of the galleries.
Great.
Okay.
Oh,
The
I'll just interject to see. I see we do have a hand raised. We will take questions at the end of our presentation. So, yes, please take a note of your questions or write them in the chat, and we will address them at the end.
Yeah. So beginning with the first gallery, On the Road to Kaido and Beyond. And this is on your left as you enter the exhibition space. It opens with a discussion of socio-political and visual discourse surrounding Meisho-e, or Prince of Famous Places. And it begins with Hiroshige's celebrated series, 53 Stations of the Tokaido Road. And the prints produced here really show idyllic landscapes that were produced during the late Edo period. In these works, the Tokugawa shogunate rule is represented as an imaginary unity absent of any overt signs of discord, to create the illusion of societal coherence. However, the prints really themselves serve as markers on the regulation and movement across Japan. And so just going through a couple of these prints right here for this section, you'll see in this one a daimyo procession that's shown making an arduous journey along the Tokaido through a heavy downpour. You'll notice that there's one implement and possibly a lance. And the lances, for example, were in terms of their number that you would see, would denote the daimyo, also known as field lords, level of importance, with fewer spears indicating lesser degrees of distinction. In this print, the status symbol level is pretty ambiguous. And that is because of the mouse spears, but also because of the Hasami Bako. I believe that's what they are, that are wrapped in cloth. Now, the amount that you could have was restricted by the Edo government. And these routes that they're taking are along the Tokaido Road. And that would head going through what you would see as Honshu, the main island of Japan. And they boasted 53 equidistant post stations. And the daimyo were required to do this alternate attendance service to go over and have their castles and then to have their mansions in Edo. So this is along that arduous trek that they would have to make. And thereby, that trek was an example to show this type of power that they had and status of authority. So moving on,
Oh, could I just ask? Sorry to
yeah, of
interrupt you.
course.
I see, can you go back to the previous?
Yes.
I see that their feet are hidden. I'm wondering, do you think those are cl like clouds or mud?
I think it's probably mud, but because there's one anecdotal story that I listened to.
Uh-huh.
And that story was this one daimyo, he was upset. He couldn't get out of, his palanquin as he was riding. He had to stay inside. But the men that he had, his porters and everyone, were going through these rugged conditions and traveling. So even though the Tokugawa shogunate they didn't create these roads, they revamped them and worked as infrastructure. It still wasn't ideal. The conditions of travel were not perfect.
Wow. I can't imagine trudging through mud that deep.
Okay. Now looking at this, you'll see exactly what I was discussing about post stations. So they served as sites of relaxation, and travelers were permitted to rest at a station one night and eat at one of its restaurants or tea houses, as you see on the left-hand side of the composition. Now, you'll also notice that there's a route going through. Those routes were not intended to go directly past the daimyo's castle. They were really going through the mercantile districts and areas, and they were rather circuitous. So that was that kind of method of going through. Now people would be able to have paperwork that would allow them to go through certain post stations, and there were restrictions really when you're thinking about who can travel. So a lot of people actually traveled under the guise of pilgrimage.
Wow.
Moving on to the next section, philosophy, religion, and politics, urban planning in Edo. It really focuses in this area on exploring the role of Neo-Confucianism as an arm of the Tokugawa shogunate within the political landscape through the frameworks of ideology, infrastructure, and place. This section also introduces the government's relationship with Shinto and Buddhism as well. During the Edo period, for example, Buddhist temples had political connections to the government and were used as a means of social control. In this print, Zoji Temple at Shiba in the snow depicts a tranquil snow scene as pedestrians go about their business and patrons come and go from the temple grounds. So Zoji became the Tokugawa's family's personal temple and was moved actually from where we would see as present-day Kojimachi to Shiba, and the location that is mentioned in the print's title. So prior to, the existence of this temple, the Tokugawa shogunate actually required all Japanese households to affiliate with Buddhist temples. And while it started as a means to suppress and extinguish the spread of Christianity that occurred during the Edo period, by the end of the period, the system functioned to track and control its population. And you'll see, and we get to maps later on. Now, in terms of sites of entertainment and pleasure, they were also relegated by the Tokugawa shogunate and informed by Neo-Confucian moral philosophy. In this print, you will see the Asakusa rice fields and Torinamachi festival. There is this cat overlooking, the fields, and you see Mount Fuji in the distance. In actuality, where the cat is and where we see from that window vantage point is indicating the new Yoshiwara, which was the red light district that was in Edo. And initially in Edo, it was on the outskirts, and then the city expanded. And then it was eventually moved to further outside on that area, and it was, a moated area and enclosed. So really this cat, which is this, surrogate for prostitute, is looking over and it's giving us indication about where we are in this print. You can also see the censorship seals and the publisher seals at the top right margin, and then the publisher seal is at the lower left.
And you can see the tiny procession, right, out in the
Yes, you can. It's a beautiful print. And now moving on to this section, changing landscapes, foreign affairs. At the conclusion of the Edo period, it was it is split between the first and second galleries on the freestanding blue wall. If you have a chance to visit the exhibition, you'll see five didactic um, five didactics, and then this one won't have its own didactic there, but the way that I structured the show is for it actually free flows throughout the first and second gallery for that dialogue. The topic really covers the transitional period from Edo to Meiji, including the Bakumatsu period and the Meiji Restoration. So the Bakumatsu period itself was marked by internal conflict between supporters of the Tokugawa shogunate and pro-imperial loyalists who wanted to overthrow that government and restore the emperor to power. And we'll look at these groupings of prints right here from that main wall. You'll see the city flourishing Tanabata Festival. Mount Fuji again is in the distance. I believe this is near where Hiroshige resided at the time. And it's during the Tanabata Festival, a reunion of the two lovers. People have their wishes hanging from the tree. It's a rather triumphant vision. However, this was produced during the Bakumatsu period where it had this conflict and unease, the intersection of increased foreigner relationships. And we see that playing out in the subsequent prints, such as the view of the Russian procession ashore playing music, where we have the diplomat Nikolai Mirsky coming through, and we can tell it's Russians by the double eagle, and as well as some other text, as well as on the belly of courage, the hand of anxiety that you see right here, which really hits upon the anxiety of people as they're dealing with the increased foreigner relations as well. Simultaneous to all this, we have Commodore Perry, for example, coming with his black ships to get those negotiations on behalf of America, requesting or demanding, I should say, Japan to open up borders. But return to Underbelly of Courage and Anxiety, there is that looming hand representing the five imperial powers, as well as they're resting on a belly. You can tell by the belly button underneath the shamisen player,
So funny.
which honestly, it's one of my favorite prints. And going into this, we can see that here for this view of Russian procession ashore playing music, and it's missing the censorship seals in the margins,
Wow.
whereas in the Tokugawa in the print Tanabata Festival, it actually has those present. So for a Kawatabon, as this is, and you'll notice the color is completely different. It is actually produced from like a soft wood block, but it means tile prints, which you can think of roof tiles. So very cheaply made. They weren't meant to be authoritative in terms of how the process that they were being made. But publishers wouldn't tie their names onto it because of censorship regulations that happened during the Edo period.
They don't want to get in trouble. But those prints are only 2 years apart.
They're only 2 years
And
apart.
it's amazing, and I think you're probably the first one who exhibited, Hiroshige's very famous Tanabata Festival print next to a kawaraban like this, and then also next to that amazing kind of satirical print, right, of the belly of courage and sh the hand of anxiety, showing both the how people felt so conflicted between hoping that they can profit off the changes and worrying that the changes are going to bring them all to financial ruin, right?
Exactly. They're afraid that it's going to bring them to financial ruin, that something's going to happen with the additional influx of foreigners, and they're packing their bags, they're rushing out. But we have people also on the belly in various stages of calm. So there are people who are getting drunk, there are people who are dancing, playing music, a
And
range of activities.
and going to Kabuki, right? The
And
two
going,
ladies who are like, well, whatever happens, we're just going to go to Kabuki, right?
yeah, exactly. Which
The
honestly is
escapists.
what still happens to this day.
Very relatable.
In the next section, religion and nationalism, Meiji and the imperial family image. This really focuses on how print culture reinforced the transformation of Japan's indigenous Shinto faith into a state-supported ideology and connected to a national pivot called away from Asia and towards Europe that anchored Japan's renewed identity as an imperial power. So, looking at this print, for example, we'll see that we're placing Emperor Meiji in the center. And I should say, before we move on to other prints, that these aren't all views that the artist would have had. They would not have been able, they didn't have front row tickets to be able to see this and have the accessibility. But what they were able to do was prepare these images for people to look at. And to enjoy. The image of Emperor Meiji, we have photography, but that was due to a court case restricted for who would have access to those photos and where the photos of the emperor would be. So what prints do offer in this case is this kind of intimate vantage point or invitation to seeing these sites. It also serves as kind of propagating different technical advancements, but also strengthen development of the westernization of Japan. Now, going into this religion section, religious practices, as I mentioned with Shinto, also transformed during this period, but specifically looking at this print of Emperor Jimmu, having climbed to the peak of Chiho in Hyoga, really depicts him looking over, and it's this part of this legend where Jimmu receives someone receives this vision, and Emperor Jimmu is guided by a three-legged crow god named Yatakarasu, sent by the sun goddess Amaterasu to guide the emperor from Kumano to Nara, where he would create the first capital of Japan. And we can see here with him with his swords, magnetama that's on his outfit. And then we have these other men who are kind of subjugated while another gentleman is pointing over to the three-legged crow. We don't see all the three legs, but we see him indicating where the emperor should be going. Now, what this series does, curiously, is it situates looking at this overall history of Japan, it puts it together as this kind of catalog of information. Um, and in that, by what I mean is we're looking at the overall history, but then also other notable figures, both mythological and real. Now, Emperor Jimmu for the Meiji government for its founding was, in terms of this, he was situated under a proclamation that all matters related to this be established on principles of Emperor Jimmu's founding, was to kind of situate him as a direct descendant of the sun goddess of Amaterasu in creating that direct lineage for Emperor Meiji. So
It's
it's
so
all connected. Go ahead, Chelsea.
It's so interesting to see the scene from ancient Japanese, past and myth, but it's situated in a landscape that is horizontal, has kind of like a distant peaks and low horizon line in a way that gives you a feeling. Actually, you mentioned earlier looking at the Hudson River School, paintings, it has that kind of grandeur, right? Would you say that this landscape is kind of borrowed from has elements that are borrowed from Western art?
That's a great question. I would say in some ways, it
Indirectly,
does
maybe.
indirectly. There's a bit of
Yeah.
a watercolor background.
Yeah, it's beautiful with those purples and oranges.
Yeah, with the purples and oranges. And also this type of when you think about the direction of someone kneeling and pointing in the direction for the general,
Oh,
that's
yeah.
another kind of
Uh-huh.
visual language that is happening. So when we look at Meiji prints, it's all kind of being circulated. What are visual languages that occurred predating Meiji within Japan, but also the influx of different materials coming from the West. They already were in Japan, to be clear, during the Edo period beforehand. However, to see that increased influx and
Uh-huh.
how it's being represented in prints through color and design is very stunning.
I know we have to move along, but can I ask just one more question about this print? I see
Yes.
the crease in the middle and I see the title about, the Great Japan history. And do you think these were bound as a book, or do the other ones that you own that your museum owns have creases too, or?
Yeah, so unfortunately, my colleague I mentioned, Pierre Carlo, he actually purchased one of the albums. We and and we're using it for those classes. But the collection at the Loeb, it looks like those were put within a book and bound. There's actually on the Verso, not for
Uh-huh.
the ones that we have, but the
Yeah.
Verso and other collections. I believe at the Ritsumeikan University, which has the largest collection of them. We have about 43, which is one of the largest in the United States. Has all this text that relates in some way
Wow. That's so
to
cool.
the images. A little bit more abstract sometimes, but it does relate to it.
So people were buying these and using them to get an illustrated overview of Japanese history.
Yeah.
That's so cool.
So just a city transformed Tokyo. This one is situated on the left-hand side of Gallery 2, and it introduces Kaika-A civilization pictures, one or two genres of prints that emerged during the early and mid-Meiji periods. In these civilization pictures, artists captured feats of urban engineering and that were orchestrated by the Meiji government. So we'll see this kind of when we're looking at this, and this is one of my favorite objects. It's a book. It's not a print. It features photography, but it's from this 10-volume series that is written. We have one name of one Japanese contributor who is Okakura Kakuzo, pardon me, and then the rest of the authorities are completely anonymous. It's all published in English, so it's targeted towards a Western audience as well. And the images within and the text are divorced from one another. So it's a great explanation or dive into looking at the crossroads of nation building that we see during the Meiji period and also exoticism and the sense of the West to have a look at old Japan. So it's how can we negotiate showing developments of westernization or imperial Japan and going into lore of a nation state, but as well as featuring tranquil views of temples and shrines, and also kind of this overall study of culture and people.
That's so great. I'm sure I'm not the only one who now like kind of covets this book. It's looks like a great
Yeah,
thing
it's in our
to take a
library's
closer look
collection.
at.
So thank you to the library. Um, and then I will, we have the horse-drawn train with the telegrams, as well as you can see the gas lights. And then we have this beautiful, brilliant Meiji red. So I just want to kind of move along a little bit. And our final gallery is
This is
Sensei.
such a rich exhibition. There's 5 sections. You said there are five
There's
sections.
technically 6 sections,
Six
um,
sections. It's
but
a
in 3 galleries,
it's great.
about 56 prints. But this is only a taste of them. And
Yeah.
Sensei and the concept of news, colonization, propaganda, and censorship. This third and final gallery describes how working hand in hand with the proliferation of Kaika-A, known as civilization pictures, war prints called Sensei furthered Imperial Japan's political agenda to instill national pride in its constituents, also considering Western audiences as well, and promoting certain terms and mottos such as Fukoku Kyohei, which meant enrich the country and strengthen the military. So these prints really captured nation's entrance into global affairs and conquest in contrast to the restrictions of news during the Edo period, even though we still see censorship seals and the addition of publishers or artist addresses in Meiji prints. Um, there is this output of discussing the news and why I'll kind of say for why we have these prints in terms of why it's not lithography or etching or photography. Printmaking allow for quick to be made in quick succession. You could have a sketch and you can go back and return, whereas photography would take a while to set up. It wasn't very efficient. So just moving along, you can see in this print by Mizuno Toshikata, it depicts the Imperial Japanese Army soldier, Captain Higuchi, facing an enemy fire while gallantly hoisting a young Chinese child over his shoulder. So, in the story of this, and it keeps on getting repeated in different prints outside of ones by Toshikata, is Captain Higuchi gallantly saving this child during the First Sino-Japanese War, holding him on his shoulder. He's allegedly been abandoned by his parents as one of the story goes. And so it's also symbolizing that Japan has the interest of China's well-being in mind. So your final print here, this triptych by Mikita Toshihide depicts the Imperial Japanese Navy's ambush on the Russian-controlled Port Arthur in Manchuria during the Russo-Japanese War. And one thing that I will say that really piqued my interest when I was looking at the print is in the upper right-hand corner. I wish I had a detail to share with y'all, is English and Japanese. So the first is that's prioritized is actually the English title of the print and subsequently followed as Japanese. Another thing that we can see is how there's a focus on military development being shown in terms of those advances of Japan as a nation. We have the soldiers who are looking at this boat that has gotten blasted, and all of this. The shells are falling amongst them as they're celebrating this victory during the Battle of Port Arthur. However, this is really a premature celebration because the following day they really hadn't destroyed as many ships by the Russian fleet, so they were forced into retreating. So this is still being produced to kind of celebrate selectively certain victories. Okay. Now, Chelsea, I would like to ask you some questions.
Sure.
Okay. In examining the idea of modernity, what do prints of the Edo and Meiji period tell us of what constitutes an enlightened civilization? Bunmei Kaika. Any intersections that you noticed with your exhibition of a couple years ago, Meiji Modern?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, well, maybe I will confine my answer right now to the Meiji period and what I see in these prints is, they're using a lot of they're using the, exact same technology as the woodblock prints of the late Edo period, but there are a number of things that are different. Of course, our wonderful colleague and teacher Henry Smith has talked about the colors and the Meiji red, and this is another print. There's too many to be a coincidence where you see a brilliant red sky, right? And so we think about, if we actually think back to, you don't have to flip to it, but the Hiroshige print of the city flourishing at Tanabata and the celebratory air of that print under, of course, the watchful eye of the Tokugawa censors. And then here, a few decades later, we see that same, function of prints kind of being souvenirs of the city, right? Of the city of Edo, Tokyo for people from other parts. So, and then we also see, the celebratory, prints that are celebrating the city's flourishing and really putting as many different types of vehicles together in the same print to give you this sense of the variety of conveyances as well as, how bustling the city is. I believe that horses were not permitted to draw carriages or carts in during Edo period in the city, right? That the use of horses, was highly restricted and regulated. And so, if I were living in the countryside and this print, fell into my hands, then I would really understand, the changes and the glass windows inside the carriage. So, I love the kind of the new things that we see in these prints, as well as the way that some of their functions are similar. And then also just the kind of aspirational look of these prints that you get the feeling, and this is something that Bradley and I talked about in Meiji Modern, you get the feeling that these works of art are not just reflecting modernity, but they're kind of constructing it, or they're constructing the buzz around it by making Tokyo perhaps look a little more modern and exciting than it actually was, or taking, cherry picking certain scenes. So if we can go to the next slide. This wonderful Chikanobu that you have in the exhibition, and this is of course the court ladies, and is that Emperor? Are we fair to assume that's Emperor Meiji there in the man?
Maybe. I'm
It's
not
unclear.
sure.
Of course,
It's
they had to leave
unclear.
him unmarked, right? But unmentioned, based on the regulations. But my colleague who researches Japanese dress points out that, of course, very, very few ladies in Meiji Japan in the 1880s would have been able to wear these bustle dresses, these, European style tailored dresses and bonnets that we see the court ladies and it wearing. And so this was definitely, not reflective of an ordinary experience, but it's definitely showcasing the aspirational status that the court ladies and the empress were, presenting at that time. And it's so interesting that the phrase kairyo or reformed, right, is listed in the title, so that they're the reformed aristocratic ladies or the reformed court ladies who are wearing these Western style dress. And of course, that term reform kairyo was a little bit controversial, I think, in this time period because it was everyone was calling for everything to be reformed, and it was this moment where people, it seems, felt really like that they're at the cusp of the era. And maybe, some people feel that now with AI, right? They feel like, well, AI is now being attached to everything, right? Then what is actually changing and what is actually staying the same? So yeah, those are my thoughts. Oh, and there's one more print, I think. So I
Yes.
just thought I would bring in a print from Meiji Modern, and I love this print from the Levenberg collection and the Schnitzer Museum of Art now in Oregon, because it shows this very fashionable family and some other people who are looking at the Saigo Takamori statue that you can still see in Ueno Park. And so they're looking at a statue that pays tribute in a very careful way to the rebellion that happened, in 1877. So it took them 2 decades, right, to create and, just put a statue here. This statue was unveiled in 1898. And so it seems like we see the future with this little boy in, military type clothing, as well as the recent past, all converging in a place that we can still go to see the cherry blossoms today, Ueno Park. So these prints really make us think about history, about change, and about how they are presenting. They have their own take on the period that they're living through, and they're not just reflections of a fact, right? So those are the pieces that I really like.
Thank you so much. That was an amazing selection. I'm really enjoying seeing the relationship between the figures, especially in this print, and the mixing of Western and traditional garb and clothing, which really brings us, I believe, tying back to this image, just about if you would like to
Yeah, I
ask
think
me
you
a
were gonna,
question.
weren't you gonna, was this one of the, so I think we're kind of running out of time, but I wanted to ask you if you could tell us about some interesting or unusual prints in the exhibition. And was this one of them that you were going to talk about?
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
there's a couple of them, but I'll hit upon this one very briskly.
Yeah.
And this print, what I would say is, what makes it interesting and how I was digging into is none of the ladies in this print are identified. Now, one of our colleagues, Allison Miller, who wrote this book, envisioning the Empress, hinted upon, it indicated that there are certain iconographies when we're looking, at, for example, Emperor Shogun during the Meiji period, Emperor Meiji's spouse. And so there are a couple of things such as the brooch that's located right along her neck, that's, the chrysanthemum pattern, as well as some of the other on the gas lamps, the, similar insignia with fewer petals, however, and this mixture of other important figures that led me to reasonably say that this print was produced during the Meiji period, as well as depicting Empress Shogun. So temporally with this work, it actually fits within right after this newspaper article went out about women, the empress making this transition to dress within Western garb and the empress encouraging people to also dress in Western garb as well. So, kind of moving on to, one of my favorite prints, and we would be remiss if we did not touch upon this one at all, which is the rice inflation satire, picture of tug of war, and personified bale of rice. Now, this is one of the acquisitions that I'm led. I realized while I was looking at the exhibition, and I work very visually when I create a show, is we were missing something, along with on the belly of courage, the hand of anxiety, satire. And to show that the news and ongoing events were discussed during the Edo period and then continued on into the Meiji period using some of the other visual cues that we might see. So at the top, we have figures holding shamisen picks, which is a homophone for bachi, meaning punishment. We have this personified rice bale, and he has along his clothes insignia, the kanji for rice, and he's being pulled down by, the everyday man trying to drag down those prices, while business people are bringing him up. And then we have, a group of foreign businessmen, you can tell by their attire, on behind the tree over to our right. And I like to say it's as if they're standing there about to eat popcorn as they're observing the hectic qualities of the masses fighting below. And the rice bale man, it's because during the Meiji period, money was, the Edo period went from being, a agrarian-based society on rice over to money, and and it wasn't backed really by anything. So rice situation shortage happened, and then there was inflation of money, which created a crazy rice shortage and inflation that existed during the Meiji period, and really relates to the rice shortage in some ways that's happening that happened in Japan that just the other year or so. And I know
Yeah, it's very topical
it's
even
very
for today.
topical. Um, so I make sure, and maybe we can just kind of
Yeah, I
quickly
think pause
really
here. Why don't you pause
pause. Yeah.
here? And we'd like to open the floor to questions. So we only have about 5 minutes left. So there's already one question in the Q&A. I believe if people have other questions, you can use the Q&A box to type it. So let's see. I will read this question out loud. Let's see. Oh yes, and we're also sharing a link to the catalog. Or rather, I have the catalog right here. Um,
Yes.
so as you can see, we have many more things that we to say, but they could actually you can ponder them by looking at the catalog, which was amazingly authored by Monique, and is wonderful. So the question now, I will read it. Thinking about the construction of modernity, artists like Kobayashi Kiyochika and Kawase Hasui depicted night scenes to view the changing landscape of modernizing Japan, and nostalgic for pre-modern Edo culture and landscapes. There is also callback to the Meisho and ukiyo-e aesthetics that established the legacy of the Edo period art within Meiji society. Are these sort of callbacks to pre-modern culture exceptions or more prolific in Meiji society? So I know that Kawase Hasui is in the 19 teens and 20s and 30s onward. Oh, so he's already harkening back to Kyochika, right? And I don't think you had any Kyochika in this exhibition, did you? Did you,
We
Mark?
have one
Oh,
print. It's the scene that is during the Sino-Japanese War, I believe.
oh,
Night is
right.
actually a night scene print, and
Uh,
it's the battle on Asan in
yeah.
Korea. So we do have one night scene
One
print.
night scene, but not one of his
Well,
landscape
actually, there's a
paintings.
couple of other night scenes,
Uh,
but they're not by
not by
Kyochika. They're
Kyochika, right? Oh
also
yeah,
the
here.
Battle of Port Arthur in Russia.
This one. If you're
Yeah.
following along on the catalog, it's plate 41. But
Yes.
yeah, so then definitely I think um the and Kyochika, when he made his series of, scenes of Tokyo in the 1870s, he was consciously hearkening back to Hiroshige. So I think to answer your question, Claire, that indeed artists were conscious of each other's work, right? And they had both, stylistic similarities as well as kind of content similarities, but there were also important differences. So if you can just flip to one of the night scenes of battle like that we've seen, we know, and Bradley Bailey, my colleague, has done research on this, that a lot of the battles did take, maybe not this one, a lot of the battles did take place at night, because under the cover of darkness, right? And that the Japanese were equipped with technology such as searchlights, and other, types of
Oh,
lenses, and so they were able to attack under the cover of darkness. So that, yeah, there you go, right there. Yeah, the Mita Toshide. So, in that sense, the representation of night here wasn't just scenic, and yet you can see that the way that the billowing smoke has been tinged with like an inky dark color. Um, that also um, that also is a aesthetic choice that helps to bring dimensionality to the print. So as well as the sparkling white on the tips of the waves that are coming from reflections of the battle and maybe of the searchlights. Okay.
yeah, we have a couple minutes left. Was there an additional question that I could answer relatively quickly or?
Well, let's see. Can I ask, are there any prints that were particularly hard to research?
Yeah, I will skip ahead to this one. And I'll say that this print was actually particularly hard to research. And yes, there's Kuzutiji written and text as well. But, there's also with some of the prints, I would say, is to verify that these are things that have actually happened. For example, the print over here to the right. Has what I would say is like kind of fake news in a sense, where it says that Murata died, at this battle, during the Satsuma Rebellion, when in actuality he died several months later. And so that happens in here. So there's an importance to kind of verify. And so when I went to this print, this Kawaraban, it shows this procession, and I was able to go through and look at some of the text and verify that it was indeed showing the procession with the diplomat Nikolai Amarov, I believe, going through. And you can see that it has a double emblazoned eagles, but there's a couple mentions about 6 months over here, the bugles, and this was a form of diplomacy over a conflict at Sakhalin Island. So I was fortunate to find this book that mentioned the incident, through Internet Archive. And then it had other sources to substantiate that this was an actual thing that happened and the reportage of this news. So I went through all up and down. Waseda University has this print. I haven't seen this print anywhere else
Wow.
that I can
Well,
verify besides.
this is just one example of the great lengths you went to so thoughtfully, research all the prints in this exhibition. You're a wonderful curator. It's such a great show. It's really rare to see an exhibition that doesn't just cover the Bakumatsu and Meiji period, but covers the Edo, Bakumatsu, and Meiji periods all together and gives us a lot of different ways to see familiar and unfamiliar prints. So congratulations, Monique. And now I'd like to hand it over to Amy Poster.
Well, as all of us can see, this is an exhibition that really draws you in. We are looking at history, we're looking at uh, politics, we're looking at various customs and social issues, as well as phenomenally great prints that were collected over this time. And I think this session is wonderful for both of you to have joined us and to give us this new kind of perspective of different approaches to Japanese woodblock prints. I'm sorry that we don't have time for more discussion tonight, but I want to not only thank our guest speakers and hope that many of you can get up to Vassar in this final week, but also to invite you to join us for our next JASA webinar, which will take place on Wednesday, July 1 at 5 p.m., when Rhiannon Paget will be introducing her current exhibition at the Ringling Museum of Art in Sarasota, In the Flesh, the Nude in Modern Japanese Art. The exhibition is currently on view and will run through August 23rd. So you see, we have a lot of interest in prints in America today, And I want to thank all of you for joining us today, and especially Monique and Chelsea for edifying us so brilliantly. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.